I stood in the back row at my sister's wedding, invisible to everyone who mattered, until a stranger in a suit called my name. Hi, I'm Caroline, and I've spent 34 years learning how to be quiet. My sister Jessica's wedding was supposed to be her perfect day, and I knew my role without anyone having to say it. I drove 6 hours from Pittsburgh to attend, bought a modest dress in a color that wouldn't draw attention, and slipped into the church 10 minutes before the ceremony started. My parents didn't save me a seat. They didn't even turn around when I walked in. I found a spot in the back, next to people I didn't know, and told myself this was fine. Jessica had always been the golden child, the one who got the college fund, the one whose achievements were framed and hung in the living room. I wasn't bitter about it, not really. I'd made peace with being the practical daughter, the one who worked her way through community college and then state school, who chose nursing because it was stable. My parents loved Jessica's ambition, her marketing career, her engagement to a lawyer named Derek. They talked about her constantly. When I called home, they'd update me on her life before asking about mine. I watched my mother fuss with Jessica's veil in the church lobby, saw my father's eyes get misty as he adjusted his tie. They looked proud in a way I'd never inspired. I'd invited them to my nursing school graduation 5 years ago, and they'd said they'd try to make it. But Jessica had a work event that weekend. I walked across that stage alone, collected my diploma, and drove myself to a diner afterward. That was the moment I realized I'd always be optional. But I still came to things. I still showed up. The ceremony started, and I watched Jessica glide down the aisle like she owned the world. She probably did, in her mind. Derek waited at the altar with this look of complete adoration, and I felt something twist in my chest. Not jealousy, exactly. More like loneliness. I'd been dating someone for 3 years, a teacher named Marcus, and my parents had met him exactly once. They didn't ask about him anymore. I wondered if they even remembered his name. Jessica's wedding had a guest list of 200 people, and I was fairly certain I was the only one sitting alone. During the vows, I noticed my Aunt Linda whispering to my cousin Rachel, both of them glancing back at me. I smiled, gave a little wave, but they looked away quickly. It was like I'd committed some social error just by existing. My phone buzzed in my purse, probably Marcus asking how it was going, but I didn't check it. I kept my eyes forward, watching my sister promise forever to someone who'd probably never even heard my name. I felt like a ghost at my own family's event. Invisible. Unnecessary. Present only because I'd foolishly thought it mattered. The reception was worse. The seating chart had me at a table in the far corner with distant relatives I'd met maybe twice. My parents sat at the head table with Jessica and Derek, laughing and toasting, never once looking my direction. I picked at my chicken, made small talk with an elderly great-uncle who kept calling me Jennifer, and wondered why I'd bothered. My mother gave a speech about how Jessica had always been destined for greatness, how she'd known since Jessica was 5 that she'd do extraordinary things. She didn't mention me, not even as an aside, not even as Jessica's sister. I was halfway through my second glass of wine when the music stopped. The DJ looked confused, and then a man in a dark suit walked to the microphone. He was maybe 50, silver-haired, with a briefcase that looked expensive. He introduced himself as Thomas Brennan, an attorney from Philadelphia, and apologized for the interruption. My father stood up, his face going red, and demanded to know what this was about. The room went silent. I sat up straighter, my heart suddenly pounding for reasons I couldn't name. Something about his presence felt significant, though I had no idea why. Mr. Brennan said he was there on behalf of my grandmother, Eleanor Hoffman, who'd passed away 3 months earlier. I'd known about her death, of course. I'd sent flowers. But my family hadn't told me about any funeral arrangements, and I'd assumed they'd handled everything privately. Jessica had mentioned it once in a text, casually, like it was barely worth noting. My grandmother and I hadn't been particularly close, mostly because my parents never facilitated that relationship. She'd lived in a nursing home near Philadelphia, and I'd only met her a handful of times. The lawyer said my grandmother had left specific instructions in her will. He looked around the room, and then his eyes landed on me. He said my name, Caroline Marie Hoffman, and asked me to come forward. Every head in that reception hall turned. My mother's face went white. Jessica looked at Derek, confusion flickering across her perfect makeup. I stood on shaky legs, my chair scraping loud against the floor, and walked toward the front. I could feel 200 pairs of eyes on me. I had no idea what was happening, but for the first time all day, I wasn't invisible. Mr. Brennan handed me an envelope. He explained that my grandmother had been following my life more closely than I'd realized. She'd hired a private investigator years ago, not for anything sinister, just to understand why her son had essentially erased one granddaughter while celebrating the other. She'd learned about my nursing degree, my volunteer work at a free clinic, the fact that I'd paid my own way through everything. She'd been moved by what she'd discovered. She wanted to make sure I knew that someone had been watching. Someone had been proud, even if I'd never felt it. The envelope contained a letter and a check. The letter was handwritten, shaky but clear. My grandmother wrote that she'd always regretted not standing up to my parents, not insisting on a relationship with me. She said she saw herself in me, the overlooked one, the practical one, the one who kept going despite everything. She apologized for not being braver while she was alive. And then she left me her entire estate, the house in Philadelphia, her savings, everything. It wasn't a fortune, but it was enough to change things. It was enough to prove that someone had seen me, even when my own parents hadn't. My mother rushed forward, stammering something about this being inappropriate, about discussing family business at a wedding. My father looked like he'd been slapped. Jessica just stared, her mouth slightly open, and I realized she'd probably expected to inherit something from our grandmother, too. Mr. Brennan calmly explained that the will was ironclad, that my grandmother had been of sound mind, and that she'd made her wishes explicitly clear. She'd even specified that the reading happen at Jessica's wedding. She wanted my parents to witness it. She wanted them to understand what they'd done and what they'd lost. I folded the letter carefully, slipped it back into the envelope, and looked at my family. For once, I didn't feel the need to apologize or make myself smaller. I thanked Mr. Brennan, shook his hand, and told him I'd be in touch. Then I turned to Jessica and said I hoped she had a beautiful marriage, and I meant it. She wasn't the villain here. She'd just been loved louder, and that had shaped both of us in different ways. I walked past my parents without saying a word. There wasn't anything to say yet. Maybe there never would be. I drove back to Pittsburgh that night, even though it was late. I couldn't stay in that hotel, couldn't pretend everything was normal. Marcus called halfway through the drive, and I told him the whole story, my voice breaking in places but steady in others. He listened without interrupting, and when I finished, he said he loved me, and that he'd always seen me. I believed him. I'd spent so long thinking I needed my family's recognition to feel whole, but maybe I'd been looking in the wrong direction. Maybe the people who truly mattered had been there all along. The inheritance changed practical things. I paid off my student loans, put a down payment on a small house, donated a portion to the free clinic where I volunteered. But the real gift was the validation. My grandmother had seen me. She'd taken the time to understand my life, to document it, to make sure I knew I wasn't invisible. That letter sat on my nightstand for months. I read it whenever I doubted myself, whenever that old feeling of being optional crept back in. It reminded me that worth isn't determined by the people who should love you but don't. Sometimes it's determined by the people who choose to see you, even from a distance. My parents called eventually, weeks after the wedding. The conversation was awkward, full of half apologies and justifications. They claimed they hadn't realized how they'd treated me, that they'd thought I was fine, that Jessica had just needed more support. I didn't argue. I didn't try to make them understand. I simply told them I needed space, and that if they wanted a relationship with me, it would have to be different. It would have to be real. They said they'd try. I told them I'd believe it when I saw it. The call ended, and I felt lighter than I had in years. Jessica reached out too, a long text message full of apologies and confusion. She said she'd never noticed how differently we were treated, that she'd always assumed I preferred being independent. I didn't blame her for that. When you're swimming in sunlight, you don't notice the shadows. We met for coffee a month later, and it was strange but not hostile. We talked about our grandmother, about the will, about the complicated dynamics we'd grown up in. She admitted she felt guilty, and I told her she didn't need to carry that. We weren't responsible for our parents' choices. We were only responsible for our own. I still think about that wedding sometimes, about standing in the back of the church feeling invisible. It's strange how one moment can rewrite everything you thought you knew about your life. My grandmother's gift wasn't really the money or the house. It was the knowledge that someone had cared enough to pay attention, to take action, to make sure I understood my value. I'd spent 34 years believing I was forgettable. She proved I wasn't. And now when I walk into a room, I don't make myself small anymore. I take up space. I exist loudly. I matter, whether anyone acknowledges it or not. The house in Philadelphia was smaller than I'd imagined. A narrow brick row house with a blue door and window boxes holding dead flowers. I drove down from Pittsburgh on a Saturday morning, Marcus beside me, both of us quiet. The key Mr. Brennan had sent felt heavy in my pocket. I'd owned the house for 2 months but hadn't visited until now. I didn't know what I'd find inside, or how it would feel to walk through my grandmother's rooms. Marcus squeezed my hand as we stood on the sidewalk. He'd taken the day off to come with me, understanding I needed support. An elderly woman sweeping her stoop next door waved at us. I waved back, wondering if she'd known my grandmother. The neighborhood felt peaceful, tree-lined and quiet. I took a breath and unlocked the door. Whatever waited inside, I wouldn't face it alone. That felt like progress already, having someone who chose to stand beside me. Inside, everything was frozen in time. Floral couch, wooden coffee table, magazines from 6 months ago. Framed photos covered every surface. I picked one up and my breath caught. It was me at my nursing school graduation, standing alone outside the auditorium. I hadn't known anyone was taking pictures. But my grandmother had somehow gotten this photo, framed it, kept it where she could see it daily. She'd been watching. She'd been documenting my life when no one else had. Marcus found more photos in the bedroom. Me as a child at a family gathering. My high school graduation. A newspaper clipping about the free clinic where I volunteered, my name highlighted in yellow. My grandmother had built a timeline of my life, saving moments my own parents never bothered to photograph. I sat on her bed surrounded by evidence that someone had been paying attention. I cried, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming weight of finally being seen. We spent hours going through the house. Her closet held simple dresses and sensible shoes. Her kitchen was meticulously organized. In a desk drawer, I found letters she'd written but never sent. Letters to my parents, asking why they'd shut her out of my life, pleading for visits, a chance to know me. My father had made excuses, canceled plans. She'd died without understanding why her son had been so cruel. It hurt to read her confusion. Her quiet heartbreak. The basement held boxes of my grandmother's life. We carried them upstairs and sorted through decades of memories. Photo albums showed a young woman with dark hair and a bright smile. Programs from my father's school plays. His report cards. Childhood drawings. She'd saved everything about him, too. I realized she'd probably treated my father the way he'd treated me, with conditional love, favoritism toward someone else. The cycle had repeated itself. Nobody had stopped it. Understanding that didn't excuse anything, though. I called my father that evening from my grandmother's kitchen. I told him what I'd found, the letters, the photos, the evidence of her regret. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said his childhood hadn't been easy, that his mother had always preferred his brother. I closed my eyes and saw the pattern clearly. He'd felt invisible once, too. He'd learned to make others invisible in return. Understanding his pain didn't excuse what he'd done to me, though. Marcus and I stayed for the weekend. We cleaned, threw out expired food, opened windows to let fresh air in. I kept most furniture but donated what I didn't need. The photos of me I packed carefully to bring home. I wanted them on my walls as reminders that this woman had cared enough to notice me. On Sunday, the neighbor from next door knocked. She introduced herself as Mrs. Chen. She'd known my grandmother for 20 years, she said. They'd had tea every Thursday. Mrs. Chen told me my grandmother had talked about me often, proud of my nursing career, worried I didn't know how much I mattered. She said my grandmother had rewritten her will 3 years ago, right after hiring that investigator. She'd wanted to make a statement, ensure I understood someone had cared. Mrs. Chen handed me a small box my grandmother had left. Inside was a silver bracelet and a note. Wear this and remember you are loved. I put it on immediately. Driving home to Pittsburgh that night, I felt different. The inheritance wasn't just money or property. It was permission to believe in my own worth, to stop waiting for my parents to see me the way my grandmother had. I'd spent 34 years hoping for their approval. Maybe it was time to stop hoping and start building a life that didn't require their validation. The bracelet on my wrist caught the streetlights. I kept glancing at it, anchoring myself in its meaning. Marcus proposed a month later. We were eating takeout on my couch when he pulled out a ring and asked if I wanted forever with him. There was no big production, no audience, just us and a simple question. I said yes. We sat there laughing and crying and making plans. We decided on a courthouse wedding, just us and 2 witnesses. I didn't want a big event. I didn't want to navigate complicated family dynamics. I wanted something simple and true. My mother called when she heard about the engagement through Jessica. Her voice was tight, hurt, asking why I hadn't told her first. I took a breath and said honestly that I hadn't thought she'd care. The silence was heavy. She said, of course she cared. I was her daughter. I asked when she'd last acted like it. The question hung between us, unanswerable. She said she wanted to come to the wedding. I told her it would just be Marcus and me. Jessica called the next day and asked to take me to lunch. We met at a cafe halfway between our cities. She looked nervous in a way I'd never seen. She apologized again, more specifically this time. She said she'd been thinking about our childhood, about all the moments she'd been celebrated while I'd been ignored. She was in therapy now, trying to understand her own complicity. She didn't expect forgiveness, but she wanted me to know she was trying. We talked for 2 hours, longer than maybe ever. Jessica admitted the inheritance had forced her to see our family clearly for the first time. She'd confronted our parents, asked why they'd treated us so differently. They'd gotten defensive, made excuses, accused her of being ungrateful. She'd realized they weren't capable of real self-reflection. It had shaken her. She'd always believed they were good parents, just busy. Now she wasn't sure what to believe anymore. I sold my grandmother's house 6 months later. I couldn't leave Pittsburgh, couldn't leave my job and my life. But I didn't want the house sitting empty. A young couple bought it, newlyweds with a baby coming. I felt good about that. My grandmother's home would be full of life again. I used part of the money for a bigger place for Marcus and me, a house with a yard and an extra bedroom. The rest I invested for our future. Marcus and I married on a Tuesday in October. The leaves were gold and red, the courthouse steps pretty for photos. My friend Jamie and Marcus's brother stood as witnesses. We signed papers, kissed in front of a bored clerk, walked out into sunshine as husband and wife. We had lunch at our favorite restaurant, just the 4 of us. It felt perfect. No drama, no tension, no complicated family dynamics. Just love and simplicity and the beginning of something new. My parents sent a card a week later. Generic, drugstore bought, with a $200 check inside. The note said, "Congratulations on your marriage. We wish you happiness." No apology. No acknowledgement of everything that had happened, just a polite, distant gesture requiring nothing from them. I stared at that card for a long time, trying to decide how I felt. Finally, I deposited the check and threw the card away. I was done waiting for them to be different. Jessica threw us a small party at her house. She invited my nursing school friends, Marcus's teacher colleagues, and Derek, who was genuinely kind once I knew him. She'd made a cake herself, decorated with photos of Marcus and me, and gave a toast about second chances and choosing your own family. It was the first time she'd done something like that for me. I hugged her afterward. She whispered she was sorry it took so long. I told her what mattered was she was trying now. I started therapy, working through decades of feeling less than, of believing I didn't deserve attention. My therapist helped me see how deeply those patterns ran, how much I'd internalized my parents' neglect. She also helped me understand that healing didn't require their participation. I could forgive them or not, maintain contact or walk away. The choice was mine. For the first time, I realized I had agency. I wasn't just reacting. I was deciding what kind of life I wanted to live. On the anniversary of my grandmother's death, I drove back to Philadelphia. I visited her grave for the first time, brought flowers, sat on the grass beside her headstone. I told her about my marriage, about the life I was building, about how her gift had changed everything. I wished I'd known her better, wished my father had let us connect. But I thanked her for seeing me anyway, for making sure I knew I'd mattered to someone. The bracelet caught the sunlight, and I felt connected to her. 2 years into my marriage, my father called. His voice sounded small, uncertain. My mother had been diagnosed with early-onset Alzheimer's at 62. The doctor said it would progress quickly. He asked if I could help with care options. The word help felt strange coming from him. I hadn't heard him ask me for anything in years, but I heard fear in his voice, real and raw. I told him we'd come visit that weekend. Marcus and I drove to my parents' house on Saturday. The house looked the same, neat lawn, perfect shutters. My father opened the door looking older, grayer. He shook Marcus's hand and led us inside. My mother sat in the living room with a photo album. She looked up and smiled, but her eyes were confused. She asked if I was one of Jessica's friends. My father's face crumpled. He said some days were better than others. We discussed care options all afternoon. My father had been handling everything alone, too proud to ask for help sooner. He'd taken leave from work. Bills were piling up. My mother needed constant supervision. She'd left the stove on twice, wandered outside in her nightgown. He looked exhausted. I felt sympathy mixed with resentment. This man had ignored me for decades. Now he needed me. Part of me wanted to walk away. Part of me couldn't. Jessica arrived that evening, still in her work clothes. She hugged our father, kissed our mother, then looked at me with an unreadable expression. We hadn't seen each other in months. She suggested we talk privately. We went to the back porch where we'd played as children. Now we sat as adults facing an impossible situation. The air between us felt heavy with unspoken expectations and old patterns neither of us wanted to repeat. Jessica said she couldn't take time off work. Derek had just made partner. They were trying for a baby. Her job was demanding. She could contribute financially, maybe hire help. I understood what she meant. She expected me to be the caretaker because I always had been. The responsible one who managed things quietly. I felt anger rise in my chest. I told her I had a life too. I wasn't sacrificing everything for parents who'd barely acknowledged me. She looked surprised, like it hadn't occurred to her I might say no. She said nursing was my field. It made sense. I laughed bitterly. Just because I knew how to care for people didn't mean I owed them my life, especially not parents who'd never properly cared for me. The silence stretched between us. Jessica started to respond, then stopped. For once, she seemed to actually hear what I was saying. Her expression shifted from defensive to thoughtful. Marcus joined us 20 minutes later. He'd been talking with my father, getting the full picture. He sat beside me and said whatever I decided, he'd support me. If I wanted to help, we'd figure it out together. If I wanted to walk away, that was valid. This wasn't my burden alone. Jessica looked at him, then at me. She said she was sorry, that she'd been thoughtless. She hadn't realized how much pressure she was putting on me. We made a plan that night at the kitchen table. Jessica would handle finances, research facilities, manage logistics. I would coordinate medical care and talk to doctors. Marcus would help with whatever we needed. We'd split responsibilities based on actual capability, not old family roles. It wasn't perfect, but it felt fairer. For the first time, we were working together as equals. No assumptions, no expectations based on who'd always been the favorite child. I visited every other weekend over the following months. I took my mother to appointments, helped my father understand the disease progression. It was hard. Some days my mother knew me. Other days I was a stranger. Once she looked at me and said, "You're the quiet one, aren't you?" I nodded. She said, "I'm sorry about that." It was the closest thing to an apology I'd ever gotten. I held her hand, not sure if she'd remember the moment. My father started opening up during late-night conversations. He told me about feeling invisible to his own mother, competing with his brother for attention. He'd promised himself he'd be different with his kids, but he'd fallen into the same patterns. He'd focused on Jessica because he saw himself in her. He'd overlooked me because I seemed capable, seemed fine. He knew that wasn't an excuse. He just didn't know how to fix what he'd broken. I didn't forgive him completely, but I started to understand him. He was flawed, damaged by his own upbringing. That didn't erase what he'd done, but it explained it. I told him if he wanted a real relationship moving forward, things had to change. No more treating me as an afterthought. He nodded, tears in his eyes, and promised to try. I'd heard promises before, but facing loss had changed something in him. Maybe this time would be different. Marcus and I started seriously discussing having kids. The fear was still there, worry I'd repeat my parents' mistakes. But my therapist said awareness was half the battle. I knew what damage looked like. I could choose differently. Marcus said we'd check in constantly, make sure we weren't falling into harmful patterns. We'd love our children equally, celebrate them equally, see them equally. With intention and work, it felt possible. It felt like something I actually wanted. Jessica got pregnant that spring. She called crying, happy and terrified. She said she'd been thinking about our childhood, about parenting differently. She didn't want to create a golden child and a forgotten one. I told her awareness was everything. The fact that she recognized the pattern meant she could break it. We talked for an hour about hopes and fears. It was the closest conversation we'd ever had. Crisis had forced us to actually see each other. My mother declined faster than expected. By the time Jessica's baby was born, she barely spoke. She lived in a care facility now, somewhere bright where professionals watched her constantly. My father visited daily. I went twice weekly. She didn't know us anymore, but we sat with her anyway. Jessica brought the baby once, a girl named Eleanor after our grandmother. My mother smiled at the baby but didn't understand who she was. My father held baby Eleanor and cried. He said he wished he could go back, do everything differently. Our grandmother had tried to warn him he was repeating patterns, but he hadn't listened. Now he saw it clearly. Too late to change the past, but not too late to acknowledge it. I watched him with Jessica's daughter and felt something soften inside me. Not forgiveness exactly. Maybe just acceptance that people were complicated, that understanding didn't require excusing. Jessica asked me to be Eleanor's godmother. She said she wanted her daughter to know me, really know me, not as an afterthought but as someone important. She wanted to model something different than what we'd grown up with. I accepted, holding the baby carefully, feeling the weight of responsibility and hope. This child would grow up knowing both her aunts equally. That felt like progress. That felt like breaking a cycle that had damaged too many generations. On my 37th birthday, Marcus told me he was ready whenever I was. Ready to start trying for our own family. I thought about my grandmother's bracelet on my wrist, about Eleanor, about cycles and courage. I thought about the family I'd come from and the family I could create. I said yes. Not because I had to, but because I wanted to. Because I believed I could do it differently. Because being seen had taught me how to see others. I got pregnant 3 months later. The test showed positive on a Tuesday morning while Marcus was at work. I sat on the bathroom floor staring at those 2 pink lines, feeling everything at once. Joy, terror, hope, doubt. I called Marcus immediately. He left school early, came home, held me while I cried. We were going to be parents. I was going to be a mother. The weight of that felt enormous, like holding my entire childhood in my hands and deciding what to keep. I didn't tell my family right away. I wanted to keep it private for a while, just mine and Marcus's secret. We went to the first ultrasound alone, heard the heartbeat, saw the tiny flicker on the screen. The technician printed pictures and I tucked them in my purse. At 12 weeks, when everything looked healthy, I finally called Jessica. She screamed with happiness, said Eleanor would have a cousin. Then she asked if I'd told our parents. I hadn't. I wasn't sure I wanted to. Marcus thought I should tell them. He said regardless of the past, they deserved to know. I understood his point, but part of me wanted to withhold this joy the way they'd withheld their attention for so many years. It felt petty, and I knew it. My therapist said I needed to decide what kind of person I wanted to be, not what kind of person they'd made me. I couldn't control their behavior, only my own response. That made sense, even if it was hard. I told my father during one of my visits. My mother was having a bad day, didn't recognize either of us. My father and I sat in the facility's cafeteria drinking bad coffee. I said I was pregnant, due in February. He looked at me for a long moment, then started crying. He said he was happy for me, that I'd be a wonderful mother. He asked if he could be involved, if he could try to be a better grandfather than he'd been a father. I told him honestly that I didn't know yet. I needed to see if his changes were real or just temporary guilt. He nodded, said he understood. He'd been going to therapy himself, working through his own childhood trauma. He was trying to understand why he'd repeated the patterns he'd sworn to break. It didn't excuse anything, but it was something. I told him he could meet the baby when the time came. After that, we'd see. It felt like the most honest thing I'd said to him. Jessica threw me a small baby shower at her house. Just close friends, Marcus's family, and a few co-workers. She didn't invite our father, respecting my boundaries. We played silly games, ate cake, opened presents. I felt loved in a way I'd never experienced at family events before. These people were celebrating me, not just going through motions. Jessica gave a toast about how excited Eleanor was to have a cousin. She said I'd inspired her to be braver, more honest. Marcus and I prepared the nursery together on weekends. We painted the walls soft yellow, assembled furniture, washed tiny clothes. He talked to my belly every night, telling the baby about the life we'd build together. He promised our child would always feel seen, always feel valued. I watched him and felt certain I'd chosen the right partner. Whatever mistakes I might make as a mother, I wouldn't make them alone. We were in this together. Truly together. My mother died 3 weeks before my due date. She'd stopped eating, stopped responding to anything. The facility called my father, who called me. I drove there immediately, still pregnant, moving slowly. She was already gone by the time I arrived. My father sat beside her bed, holding her hand. He looked hollow. I sat with him, my hand on my belly, feeling my baby kick. Life and death in the same room. The circle continuing despite everything. The funeral was small. Jessica and Derek came. Marcus stayed close to my side. A few of my mother's old friends attended. My father gave a brief eulogy about the woman she'd been before the disease, the mother she'd tried to be. He didn't pretend their marriage had been perfect or that she'd been perfect. He just said she'd done her best with what she'd known. I appreciated the honesty. It felt more real than pretending everything had been wonderful. After the service, Jessica and I stood by the grave. She held Eleanor, who was almost a year old now. I rested my hand on my pregnant belly. Jessica said she felt guilty for not feeling more sad. Our mother had never really known her, not the real her. She'd loved an idea of Jessica, a perfect daughter who didn't actually exist. I understood that. Our mother had never known me either. We were mourning women who'd never fully seen us. That was its own kind of grief. I went into labor 2 weeks later on a Sunday morning. Marcus drove carefully to the hospital while I breathed through contractions. Labor lasted 14 hours. Marcus never left my side, holding my hand, telling me I was strong. When our daughter finally arrived, tiny and perfect and screaming, I felt something shift inside me. This was it. My chance to do everything differently. My chance to see my child completely, love her unconditionally, never make her feel invisible or less than. We named her Ruth Eleanor. Ruth after Marcus's grandmother, Eleanor after mine. When the nurse placed her in my arms, I looked at her face and made a silent promise. I would never make her compete for my attention. I would never choose favorites if we had more children. I would see her, celebrate her, love her loudly. She would never wonder if she mattered. She would never feel like a ghost in her own family. The weight of that promise felt sacred. My father came to meet Ruth the next day. He held her carefully, tears streaming down his face. He said she was beautiful. He asked if he could be part of her life. I told him yes, but on my terms. He'd see her regularly, but I'd be watching. If he ever showed favoritism, if he ever made any future children feel less important, he'd lose access. He agreed without hesitation. He said he'd spend the rest of his life trying to do better. Jessica visited with Eleanor that afternoon. The two little girls, cousins, born less than a year apart. Jessica said they'd grow up together, grow up differently than we had. They'd be friends, not competitors. They'd both feel loved and seen. I watched her with Eleanor and believed her. We'd both been shaped by our parents' failures. Now we had the chance to shape our daughters with intention. It wouldn't be perfect, but it would be different. Marcus and I brought Ruth home on a Wednesday. The house felt different with her in it. Fuller, louder, more alive. I sat in the nursery at 3 a.m. feeding her, exhausted and overwhelmed, and completely in love. My grandmother's bracelet caught the nightlight's glow. I thought about inheritance, about what we passed down. Not just money or houses, but patterns and wounds and the choice to heal them. Ruth would inherit my awareness, my determination to break cycles. The first few months were hard. I was tired constantly, learning to breastfeed, figuring out sleep schedules. Marcus took paternity leave, and we fumbled through it together. My father visited weekly, always respectful of boundaries, always asking before offering advice. Jessica called often, comparing notes on motherhood. We were building something new, all of us. Not perfect, but real. Not without history, but not defined by it either. We were choosing what to carry forward and what to leave behind. On Ruth's first Christmas, we hosted at our house. My father came, Jessica and Derek and Eleanor, Marcus's family. I looked around at everyone holding Ruth, cooing over her, celebrating her existence. Nobody was invisible in this room. Nobody was forgotten. My daughter was surrounded by people who saw her, who would help me teach her that she mattered. I felt my grandmother's presence somehow, like she was watching. Proud that I'd broken the cycle she couldn't break herself. Ruth turned 3 on a Saturday in February. We threw a party in our backyard with balloons and a homemade cake. Eleanor was there, now 4 years old, running around with Ruth like they'd been best friends forever. Jessica helped me set up while Marcus grilled hot dogs. My father arrived with presents, sitting quietly on the porch, watching everything with careful attention. He'd kept every promise he'd made. He showed up consistently, never played favorites, always asked permission before overstepping. It still felt strange sometimes, having him present in my life. I watched Ruth blow out her candles, her face lit up with pure joy. Everyone sang to her: Marcus, Jessica, Derek, my father, Marcus's parents, our friends. She was surrounded by people who celebrated her, who saw her, who made her feel important. I thought about my own childhood birthdays, the ones where Jessica got the bigger party, the better gifts, the louder attention. Ruth would never know that feeling. She'd never wonder if she mattered. That realization made me tear up a little. Happy tears this time. After the party, Jessica and I cleaned up while the kids played. She told me she was pregnant again, due in August. She looked nervous when she said it, like she was worried I'd be upset. I hugged her hard and said I was thrilled for her. She confessed she was scared about managing 2 kids, scared about treating them equally. I told her the fear meant she was aware, and awareness was everything. We were breaking cycles our parents never even recognized existed. That took courage every single day. My father stayed late helping pack up decorations. He watched Ruth play with her new toys, this soft expression on his face. He said watching me parent made him realize how much he'd missed with me and Jessica. He couldn't get those years back, but he was grateful I'd given him this second chance. I told him honestly that some days were still hard, that I still carried anger about my childhood, but I was trying to separate past from present. Marcus put Ruth to bed that night while I stood in her doorway watching. He read her favorite book twice, kissed her forehead, told her she was loved. Ruth asked if Grandpa had fun at her party. Marcus said yes. Grandpa had a wonderful time. She smiled and said she loved Grandpa. Something twisted in my chest hearing that. My daughter had a relationship with my father that I'd never had. That should have hurt, but instead it felt like healing. The cycle was truly broken. I'd gotten pregnant again 6 months earlier. We hadn't told many people yet, waiting until I was further along. But that night, lying in bed with Marcus, I said maybe it was time. We were having a boy this time. Ruth would be a big sister. I felt ready for it now, more confident in my parenting. I'd spent 3 years proving to myself I could do this differently. I could love 2 children equally, celebrate them both, make sure neither ever felt invisible or less important than the other. We told Ruth about the baby the next morning. She was excited, asking a million questions about when he'd arrive and what we'd name him. Marcus suggested she help pick the name. We'd narrowed it down to 2 options. She chose Henry without hesitation, said it sounded strong. So Henry it was. I loved that she got to be part of the decision. Everything about this family was collaborative, intentional. Nothing was assumed or decided by old patterns we didn't question. Jessica came over for lunch the following week. Eleanor played with Ruth while we sat in the kitchen drinking tea. Jessica said she'd been thinking about our grandmother lately, about the will reading at her wedding. She'd been so shocked that day, almost offended. Now she understood what our grandmother had been trying to do. She'd been holding up a mirror, forcing everyone to see the truth. Jessica was grateful for that disruption now. It had changed everything for both of us. I told Jessica about a letter I'd written to our grandmother's grave. I'd never sent it, just kept it in a drawer, but writing it had helped. I'd thanked her for seeing me, for documenting my life, for making sure I knew I mattered. I'd told her about Ruth and Henry, about breaking the cycle she'd tried to break. I'd promised her that her great-grandchildren would grow up differently. They'd grow up knowing they were all equally valued. Jessica said she wanted to write a letter too. My father started therapy with me a few months later. Joint sessions, trying to work through decades of damage together. It was uncomfortable at first, sitting in that office facing each other while a stranger asked hard questions. But slowly, we made progress. He apologized specifically for things I'd never heard him acknowledge. Missing my graduation, forgetting my birthday, never asking about my life, treating me like I was optional. I shared how deeply those things had hurt, how they'd shaped my entire sense of self-worth. The therapist asked what I needed from him moving forward. I said consistency. I said I needed him to show up for Ruth and Henry the way he'd never shown up for me. Not to make up for the past, but to be better now. He promised he would. And so far he had. He came to Ruth's preschool performances. He called weekly to check in. He sent cards on holidays. Small things, but they added up. They proved he was trying to change, not just saying he would. Henry was born in October, a week before his due date. Labor was faster this time, only 6 hours. Ruth met her brother in the hospital, climbing carefully onto my bed to see him. She touched his tiny hand and declared she'd protect him forever. I watched her with him and felt my heart expand. My children would have each other in ways Jessica and I never had. They'd be allies, not competitors. They'd grow up in a house where love wasn't rationed or conditional. My father held Henry and cried again, just like he had with Ruth. He said he was sorry to all of us, me, Marcus, even the babies who couldn't understand. Sorry for what he'd done. Sorry for what he'd failed to do. I told him we were here now, in this moment, and that's what mattered. I couldn't erase the past, couldn't pretend it didn't hurt, but I could choose whether to let it define our future. I was choosing to move forward, cautiously but genuinely. Jessica had her second baby 2 months after Henry. Another girl, named Claire. 4 cousins now, all under 5 years old, growing up together at birthday parties and holidays. Jessica and I joked about how chaotic family gatherings would be, but beneath the jokes was real gratitude. Our children would never feel what we'd felt. They'd never compete for scraps of attention. They'd see their mothers as friends, their grandfather as someone who'd learned from his mistakes, their family as imperfect but trying. On Mother's Day that year, Marcus brought me breakfast in bed while the kids helped from the doorway. Ruth brought me a drawing she'd made at preschool, a picture of our family. Me, Marcus, her, and baby Henry, all holding hands. She'd written, "I love you, Mommy," in shaky letters at the top. I started crying looking at it. Marcus asked if I was okay. I told him I was more than okay. I was healing. I was whole. I was the mother I'd needed. I wore my grandmother's bracelet every day still. Sometimes people asked about it, and I'd tell them the story. Not all of it, just enough to explain why it mattered. A gift from someone who saw me when nobody else did. A reminder that being overlooked doesn't mean being unworthy. Ruth liked to touch the bracelet sometimes, running her small fingers over the silver. I told her it would be hers someday, along with the story of the woman who'd given it to me. That afternoon, while the kids napped, I sat on our back porch with coffee in silence. I thought about the woman I'd been at Jessica's wedding, sitting in that back row feeling invisible. I thought about my grandmother's letter, the lawyer stepping forward, everything changing in an instant. I thought about the house in Philadelphia, the photos, the proof that I'd mattered. 5 years had passed since then. 5 years of therapy and boundaries and choosing differently. 5 years of building something new from the ruins of something broken. I'd done it. We'd done it. The cycle was broken, and my children would inherit something better. They'd inherit awareness, intention, and the knowledge that they were seen completely. That was the real inheritance. That was what I'd pass forward. And it was enough.